The room smelled of burnt coffee and plastic, as Amir hunched over his cracked laptop in the near-empty internet cafe, while the live stream count climbed, then froze and crashed, sending a burst of angry comments scrolling like static. A rival influencer in the next booth scoffed and tapped his sleek setup, making a show of superiority. Amir whispered that this was the moment that would change everything. And the banner from a major tech blog suddenly flared across his screen announcing his language app as the next big thing. The light exploded, and then the power cut, plunging everything into darkness. His sister grabbed his hand, eyes fierce, and said, "They will see you," and in the silence he felt humiliation curdle into something sharp and necessary. He stared into the dark screen and promised himself he would not disappear again. Amir had not always wanted to build an empire. He wanted to escape the sting of being invisible in classrooms and the shame of unpaid fees. He carried the echo of a counselor saying that ambition was a luxury for people like others, and had folded his hope into jokes to keep it from cracking. Every night he coded under a bare bulb while his younger sister slept above, her soft breathing a reminder that failure would ripple through their shared small space. When a classmate mocked his broken English and laughed loud enough to make the room lean toward cruelty, Amir went home and opened the primitive prototype of his language app. He whispered into the quiet code, "I will teach myself to belong," and began to rewrite every rule that had whispered he did not matter. The first public presentation to a local youth tech group unraveled into humiliation. The outdated projector stuttered, the interface glitched, and the polished organizer, with a forced smile, suggested that Amir had lifted the idea from someone with deeper pockets because his design was too similar to a trending app. Whispers rippled like verdicts through the crowded room, and the organizer said, "You should stick to dreaming and leave execution to people who can pay," as if dreams without money were invisible. Amir stood frozen, his months of silent work feeling like a fraud, while the only thing he possessed, his code, sat there failing to defend him. He wanted to speak, to claw back dignity, but the silence became a heavier accusation than their laughter. After the public shaming, Amir climbed to the rooftop above their cramped building, the city stretching in mottled layers beneath a bleeding sunset. He opened a forgotten folder in his code repository and played a shaky video from his late mentor Professor Farouk, who had once told him that waiting for permission was its own slow death. The professor's voice, trembling with memory, insisted that failure was honorable compared to a life spent shrinking. Amir replayed the message until anger dissolved into resolve, and whispered to the empty air that he would rebuild not to spite the organizer, but to give the timid a language that ensured they could not be dismissed as quiet. The wind carried the last light, and his decision felt like a blade forged from past scars. He tore apart the earlier version and rebuilt everything from raw intention, abandoning borrowed aesthetics and returning to the core engine that made users feel heard. His sister became both critic and collaborator, correcting pronunciation not as correction but as care, their laughter stitching new rhythm into the interface. Dawn crept through cracked glass while neighborhood dogs barked their morning greetings, and Amir treated each bug like a riddle left by his own stubbornness, solving one then another, whispering to the room that if the app could teach him the language of respect from a world that ignored him, it might teach others to speak confidence into their lives. Every line of code was a promise, and hope tasted like burnt tea. Word spread through the neighborhood like a rumor with teeth, and Amir found himself drowning in conflicting attention. Small-time investors arrived with smooth words offering partnerships if he would hand over control. University students offered to market it for a cut, and teachers whispered that he should monetize the desperation of parents whose children flunked language exams. Each proposal carried the same weight of expectation with a different flavor of exploitation. Amir sat at the same table where he had first vowed to teach himself to belong, and felt the pressure of being seen turn into a cage. His sister watched him field calls and told him, "You are not a product to be sold to the highest bidder," and he realized the world wanted his voice but only on terms that muffled it. The app was growing teeth, and others wanted to dictate what it could bite. The more Amir defended his independence, the louder the backlash became. A local education blogger wrote a piece questioning whether a broke teen could really build something meaningful, and framed his refusal to compromise as arrogance. His rival influencer amplified the story, adding a sneer about entitlement while subtly implying the app would collapse without a corporate sponsor. Comments poured in demanding transparency and accusing him of hiding something, and an old acquaintance from school reached out to offer a quick buyout disguised as concern. The shame of being portrayed as selfish cracked the brittle new confidence he had forged, and he caught himself repeating the blogger's phrasing in his head as he coded, sounding hollow even to himself. He whispered to the screen that he was not a publicity stunt, and that integrity would cost him everything before it made him someone. The first wave of users arrived, and their experiences were uneven. Some praised the app for making difficult words feel within reach, while others complained publicly that it mispronounced regional dialects or seemed too simplistic for advanced learners. A teacher who had once dismissed him now posted a viral video accusing the app of cultural insensitivity because it merged phrases from different communities without permission. The criticism landed like a flurry of stones, reopening old wounds about not belonging and twisting his own intentions into negligence. He spent nights comparing dialect databases, trying to trace where the offense had come from, and realized that in his attempt to unify, he had flattened nuance. He sat with his sister and said, "I wanted everyone to feel heard. And instead I made some feel erased," and she replied, "Then fix it where it hurts." Desperation pulled at him from another direction, when a mid-level bureaucrat from the education department demanded a demonstration and threatened to shut him down for lacking official approval, citing regulations nobody had warned him about. The same system that had ignored his silent struggles now dangled compliance like a gatekeeper's key, requiring paperwork he could not afford and connections he did not have. He went to the office with trembling hands, carrying a printout of user testimonials and a patched prototype, only to be met with a curt clerk who asked, "Who gave you permission to build something that touches the curriculum?" and then passed him to a superior who suggested he partner with an accredited institution or disappear. The world had moved from whispering that he was nothing to loudly dictating that he could not exist unless it was on their terms. The accumulation of pressure fractured the thin line between persistence and collapse when the app's server went down during a critical community learning session, wiping out hours of data and triggering a wave of blame from users who had invested their time and trust. Amir watched the error log scroll like a confession of failure and felt the earlier promise to himself sag under the weight of expectations he had not asked for but now carried. He stayed up all night, rebuilding the lost progress, patching the backend while his sister brewed bitter tea, and read aloud user messages that alternated between encouragement and accusation. He finally sent a quiet update that admitted the outage, explained the fix, and offered a small free bonus for affected users, knowing honesty might cost him credibility, but lying would cost him the one thing left, the fragile loyalty that had kept him moving. Momentum arrived like a tide, pulling him forward and threatening to drown him. Amir's language app began getting attention beyond the neighborhood. Small blogs wrote sympathetic pieces, and a few teachers quietly recommended it to struggling students. The praise felt foreign and heavy because every compliment carried a hidden question: what did you give up to build this? He received an invitation to speak at a regional youth innovation meet, and the organizers framed it as a chance to validate his work in front of donors. He prepared, rehearsing his story of broken classes and coded hope. But when he stepped onto the stage, the microphone crackled, and the sponsors in tailored suits leaned in with polite smiles that smelled like conditional approval. He watched eyes shift between curiosity and calculation and thought about the contracts from Act 2. His sister's warning echoed, "You are not a product to be sold," and he began the talk not to impress, but to make the room feel the weight of being invisible. The talk opened with silence, and then a ripple as he spoke honestly about being dismissed and told ambition was not for him. A few in the crowd leaned forward, and one donor whispered to her companion that the sincerity was rare. Others smoothed their faces, uncomfortable with a narrative that had no gloss. Midway through, a well-connected mentor from a tech incubator stood, asked a sharp question about scalability, and then offered help if Amir would accept their prepackaged growth plan that would subsume his user voice analytics into their branded framework. The mentor said, "We can get you investment in users, but you have to let us shape the core experience," and murmurs spread that compromise was the price of survival. Amir paused, feeling the old pull of needing approval, then answered plainly that the app belonged to its users, not to polished accelerators, and the room exhaled like a held breath. After the event, a small group of passionate early adopters gathered around him, offering stories of how the app had made a quiet child speak up in class or a migrant worker finally understand a bureaucratic form. Their gratitude was intoxicating, but the exposure also drew predators anew. A regional education consultant contacted him with a framed endorsement, then subtly suggested inserting sponsored content to side development. Amir remembered the journalist's doubt, the bureaucrat's dismissal, and the mentor's conditional help, and felt the walls of his own values bending under practical need. He met the consultant in a crowded cafe, and when the consultant said, "Everyone pays to be heard," Amir replied, "Not if it silences the ones who need it most," and the consultant's polite smile tightened into a thin line of calculation. The refusal to bend cost him immediate growth. The mentor's network cooled, and the consultant quietly stopped returning messages. The regional innovation meet published a summary and buried his name beneath safe headline phrases, softening his message into something palatable for sponsors. His user base plateaued even as word of mouth flickered in corners. He found himself replaying the conversation with the mentor and the consultant, wondering if survival required another sacrifice. His sister, watching the slump in his shoulders, told him that persistence without adaptation was stubbornness and adaptation without integrity was surrender. He sat with those tensions in the thin glow of his laptop and wrote a new update explaining his stance publicly, not asking for praise but laying bare that growth would come only if the app stayed true to the voices it served. The tide shifted unexpectedly when a grassroots teacher collective discovered his transparency post and amplified it across their own channels, sharing how he had refused to sell out despite pressure. Their young students posted videos of themselves practicing with the app, smiling as if the interface spoke their names with care. And the small collective sent him a heartfelt message that he was not just building software, but reclaiming respect for their dialects. The earlier plateau cracked and a new kind of growth arrived, slower, less polished, but rooted in loyalty. Amir felt relief wash over him, not from validation but from alignment. He understood that the audience he sought were not the wealthy patrons, but the ones who had once been told they didn't belong. He whispered to his sister, "They see it now." And she replied, "They always could, you just let them in." The unexpected twist arrived as the person Amir had least suspected stepped forward. The polished organizer from the first presentation had quietly been following the grassroots teacher collective, and, seeing their amplification, contacted him with an offer that sounded like salvation, a corporate-backed accelerator slot promising scale, mentorship, and a spotlight at a national conference. The organizer framed it as recognition, not compromise, insisting that joining would validate his integrity. Amir felt the old pull of approval in the slick language of partnership, while his sister warned that the same voices that once dismissed him now wanted to own the story. He asked, "What do you really want from me?" And the organizer replied with a soft smile, "Only your promise to let us shape the narrative," and the moment split between opportunity and surrender. Amir agreed to a trial collaboration, not fully trusting the clean words, but hoping to retain authorship, and the accelerator's machinery whirred into motion. Suddenly polished copywriters rephrased his mission, the interface got subtle overlays promoting affiliated sponsors, and the teacher collective's endorsement was rebranded into a case study that framed them as grateful beneficiaries rather than partners. The organizer praised the evolution, while quietly slipping terms into the schedule that blurred who owned user stories. Amir felt the old wound reopen, as the voices of his early supporters became footnotes in glossy presentations, and he murmured to himself that the language of compromise sounded like progress until it erased the original accent of his purpose. The major twist struck when the organizer's backing, once a promise validation, inverted into leverage, A rival startup accused Amir's app of having borrowed proprietary modules from the accelerator's network, dragging his name into a public dispute over originality. The accusations spread fast, fueled by a sanitized press release that used his brief partnership to cast doubt on his independence, and donors who had been curious went quiet. Amir sat in the same room where loyalty had been built, watching his own narrative be edited by others, and realizing the organizer had quietly handed control of the story to third parties in exchange for visibility. His sister said, "They built the frame and now they're shaking it," and he understood that the ally had become a weapon, and the fight was no longer just for growth, but for the truth of who had started it. The fallout fractured the fragile new coalition. The teacher collective distanced themselves to avoid being tainted by controversy, while the accelerator quietly receded, murmuring about misalignment and suggesting that perhaps Amir was not ready for the next phase. The public narrative had inverted his refusal to sell out into a liability, and he felt the ground tilt as supporters questioned whether his integrity had cost them stability. He gathered the pieces in silence, drafting a raw public response that did not appeal to sympathy but laid out the sequence of events, naming neither enemy nor savior, and he sent it out into the thin current of social media. The message was stripped of flourish, and when his sister read it aloud, she said, "This is the first time they'll hear it uncut." Instead of crumbling, the twist forged a new axis. Grassroots voices that had once amplified him now rallied again with more clarity, this time shielding him from the smear by retelling the story in their own words. A former critic turned ally published a nuanced breakdown of what had happened, naming the overreach without sensationalism and crediting Amir's original intent. That unexpected public defense, coming from someone who had publicly doubted him earlier, cut through the noise like light through smoke and brought back a cautious resurgence of trust. Amir realized the betrayal had not been the accelerator's offer but his own near abandonment of the very people who had made him real. He sent a private thank you to the critic and told his sister, "The ones who have broken me just rebuilt the bridge," and she smiled, saying bridges last when they're walked together. Amir's growing influence caught the attention of a regional education conference organizer who invited him to sit on a panel about grassroots innovation, framing it as a platform to elevate unheard voices. He arrived wary, carrying the weight of recent betrayals, and found himself surrounded by representatives from established foundations and a few bright-eyed students. When it was his turn, he did not rehearse polished sound bites. He spoke plainly about how the app had been twisted, how offers had come with strings, and how loyalty had rebuilt him. A skeptical foundation representative leaned in and asked if he would finally trade purity for scale, and Amir replied that scale without truth was a house built on sand, and the room held its breath. His sister, watching from the edge, nodded, and the students in the back began whispering that his refusal felt like a promise, not a rejection. After the panel, a small nonprofit from a neighboring district reached out, offering access to their network of volunteer teachers if Amir would help them build a localized version of the app, free for underfunded schools. The offer carried no glossy pitch deck, only a handwritten note from their director, saying they believed in what he had refused to sell. He hesitated because his recent exposure had taught him that even generosity could morph into obligation, but the director added, "We do not want to own it, we want it to breathe here." And Amir felt something unstiffen in his chest. He agreed, not with a public statement but with a quiet code merge, and the first localized module began to take shape with dialects he had previously feared flattening. His sister, reading the director's note over his shoulder, whispered, "This is the kind of echo that doesn't fade." The deeper integration with the nonprofit exposed the cracks left by earlier compromises when a well-meaning donor insisted on branding the localized version to boost their visibility. The donor argued that a logo would legitimize the free rollout and attract more support. But Amir saw the familiar drift toward dilution. The app's voice had started to carry an accent not its own. He confronted the donor in a tense conversation, saying that the children learning from it needed clarity, not another label they had to decode, and the donor, surprised, replied that visibility was the only currency that opened doors. Amir retorted that the app's currency was trust, and if that was spent for visibility, it would bankrupt the very people it intended to help. His sister, who had sat quietly nearby, added, "You can't trade their names for someone else's stamp," and the donor fell silent. The refusal to brand the localized version triggered backlash from the donors' network, who whispered that Amir was ungrateful and idealistic to the point of jeopardizing scale. The rumor mill spun that he was sabotaging chance after chance, and a few early partner schools hesitated, fearing instability. The pressure returned like a storm's surge, and he found himself replaying the moment with the donor, wondering if he had been naive to think the new alliance would remain untouched by outside demands. His sister reminded him that what endured was shaped not by absence of resistance, but by surviving through it, and he drafted a public letter to the partner schools, explaining the decision, owning the risk and reaffirming the commitment to clarity over borrowed prestige. The response was mixed, but some teachers replied with gratitude for honesty, and that slender trust began knitting again. The culmination of the act arrived when the localized version, unbranded and unpolished, began performing better than the donor's heavily promoted pilot in similar districts, because teachers trusted it and passed it along without pretense. Word-of-mouth testimonials arrived not as curated endorsements, but as raw videos of children reciting phrases they once feared, and the nonprofit's director sent a message celebrating that the app was now teaching teachers how to listen. The earlier tension transformed into a quiet victory. Amir understood that influence could grow without compromise if it was carried by those who believed rather than bought in. He turned to his sister and said, "We kept the accent of truth." And she replied, "That's the one language they never forget." The calm before the storm felt like permission. Amir believed the grassroots reinforcement had immunized him against betrayal. So when a surprising offer came from a regional education ministry official proposing a public endorsement and inclusion in a pilot program, it landed as validation rather than threat. The official praised his integrity and framed the partnership as a way to bring the app to rural schools. But beneath the polished language was a demand: their branding on the home screen and access to user analytics for policy refinement. Amir hesitated, recalling every compromise that had tried to mask itself as help, and his sister warned, "They will give you a cloak and call it protection." He agreed to a limited endorsement, thinking visibility could be a shield, not a cage. The endorsement rolled out with fanfare. Regional press released stories lauding the app as a model of citizen-driven innovation, and pilot classrooms received new tablets stamped with the ministry's logo alongside his. The visibility brought a flood of new users, but the officials' requested data access arrived as a quiet expectation: aggregated pronunciation patterns, demographic slices, and teacher usage habits. Amir felt the familiar erosion begin as the officials' team suggested he automate consent language in the onboarding flow, softening its appearance into standard procedure. He confronted them, saying that trust could not be harvested like a dataset, and that clarity with users was the only honest path, and the lead advisor replied, "Every system needs inputs to improve, framing compliance as mutual benefit." His sister muttered, "They're asking for whispers and calling it dialogue." The twist revealed itself when the endorsement, originally a badge of legitimacy, became a lever for control. The ministry quietly began promoting a standardized curriculum that funneled learners through the app in ways that suppressed regional adaptations he had painstakingly built. Local teachers received directives to prioritize official modules, and feedback channels were rerouted to the ministry's oversight team, muting authentic user voices. Amir discovered that his agreement had been stretched. The branding now implied the app was officially developed by the ministry, and his own credit was minimized in public materials. He confronted the official in a tense hallway, and the official said, "We only expanded your reach, not your authorship," while his sister stood behind him, eyes sharp, saying, "You sold the accent for the echo," and Amir realized the endorsement had become a rewrite of authorship. The backlash came without ceremony. The grassroots networks that had once shielded him now questioned why the app seemed to speak the ministry's language instead of theirs. A leaked internal memo from the ministry, shared quietly by a sympathetic contact, revealed that the standardized modules were intended to centralize influence under the guise of quality control, and teachers who resisted risked losing official support. Amir's transparency post about the shift spread again, but this time it was met with fatigue and suspicion, and some partner schools paused their use, citing confusion about who the app truly served. He sat with his sister and said, "I thought legitimacy would protect us," and she replied, "They built a mirror and called it reflection," and he knew exposure without agency had become its own compromise. The climax of the act arrived as Amir chose rupture over quiet assimilation. He publicly disentangled the app from the ministry's softened narrative, releasing a clarified version that restored local adaptations, appended a candid explanation of the endorsement's drift, and provided an opt-in audit log for users to see who had touched their data. The official backlash was swift, with threats of withdrawing the pilot and public statements questioning his loyalty, but the teacher collective rallied, translating his message into regional dialects and distributing printed guides that explained the restored agency in plain terms. His sister, watching the fragmented public reaction, said, "Breaking the mirror will bruise, but at least now we see who's looking," and Amir felt a bruised clarity settle, knowing the fight had reclaimed the story. The final escalation gathered all the fractures into a single moment when a national education summit announced a public evaluation of language tools and invited Amir to present alongside well-funded competitors. The summit was framed as judgment and validation in the same breath, and he arrived carrying the cleared story from the ministry rupture, the grassroots loyalty, and the weight of every compromise avoided. On stage, the moderator asked about his journey, and the room heard the unedited sequence of betrayal, appropriation, and reclamation. A corporate representative tried to preempt with polished statistics, but Amir held up a printed guide translated into regional dialects and said, "The score is not in downloads or logos, it is in the voices that were almost silenced and are now speaking for themselves," and the audience shifted, not in applause first but in a quiet recalibration of who deserved attention. The summit's panel discussion turned into a reckoning when a respected elder from a rural district stood and shared a recorded testimony of a child who had been mocked for mispronouncing words and now recited them with confidence because of Amir's unfiltered act. The elder's voice carried a resonance that statistics could not mimic, and the sponsors who had tuned in to find weakness found themselves leaning toward him, asking questions about sustainability rather than scalability. Amir answered by describing the long series of choices that led to this moment, including ruptures and restorations, and he said that the real leverage came from the people who refused to let their stories be rewritten. His sister, watching from the side stage, exhaled as if a held silence had finally been given shape. The climax arrived when a former adversary, the organizer who had first offered the accelerator slot, took the stage and, to the surprise of many, publicly retracted the sanitized narrative he had once pushed, acknowledging how his earlier attempt to shape the story had contributed to the chaos and praising Amir's decision to reclaim authorship. The room trembled as the ally-turned-antagonist became a witness to the truth he had helped distort, and the crowd sensed that the story had completed a loop, not by erasing the past, but by naming it. Amir, unflinching, said that redemption was not a trophy handed down, but a bridge rebuilt with people who had been near broken, and the apology landed not as absolution, but as another piece in the mosaic of what had become real. The resolution unfolded in the quiet aftermath, when invitations arrived, not from the usual polished institutions, but from regional schools, teacher collectives, and independent educators, asking to partner on terms he helped define. The APEP's codebase was open-sourced in a modest repository, with clear attribution guidelines, and community-maintained dialect modules, and revenue offers arrived only after mutual auditing and agreement on value exchange. He no longer felt the acute hunger for validation. Instead, he felt responsibility deepen because the audience had shifted from watchers to stewards. He told his sister that the world had kept trying to reshape him, and she replied that he had finally built something that reshaped the world around him without losing its original accent. In the final heartbeat, the storyteller reveals the lingering shock. Despite offers of acquisition, political pressure, and the temptation to monetize the secret sauce, Amir chooses to withdraw from the spotlight and quietly embeds the core of the app into community-run learning hubs, letting it live where voices are shaped by users, rather than algorithms optimized for attention. The last image carried a chilling clarity because the world still whispers his name in corridors of power, as though he had vanished, not realizing he had simply made himself unable. His sister, now older by the years of struggle, whispered, "They still try to sell the story, but we keep giving it away." And Amir nodded, knowing that silence had become their loudest legacy.